So thank you for your patience as well. Okay, yeah. So thanks again for the opportunity to present here. My talk is about moral enhancement through moral identity. And now I just briefly give you an overview of what I intend to do during this presentation. So first, I give a brief outline of moral technological enhancement, which I'll be concerned with. I then propose a dilemma. And the main part of my presentation actually serves to tackle this dilemma. That being said, I'm not going to present any actual solution to it, but I rather take this dilemma in order to outline or draw certain conclusions with regard to technological moral enhancement. So anyways, here goes under the heading of tackling the dilemma, which has two parts. First part, where I present two arguments against what I call cognitivist pluralist systems. We'll get clear in a bit. I then present a new focus, namely moral identity. And the second part of tackling the dilemma, where I just very briefly mention a possible precondition, and I then conclude. Okay, so that's the overview. So let me briefly start with a very short definition of what moral technological enhancement is. I'm just going to read this quote. Namely, it is any change in a moral agent, affected or facilitated in some significant way by the application of a technology that results or is reasonably expected to result in A's being a morally better agent. So apparently the basic idea here is we achieve moral betterment on an agential level. So through moral enhancement, people turn into morally better agents. I just leave it at that. And also this happens with the help of technology. When it comes to the kind of technology involved here, people often just speak of AI. Maybe you heard something like moral AI, things like that. That's partly correct. I mean, I guess partly it's AI based, but partly I think it's broader, namely, I guess we can reasonably talk about ICTs, information communication technologies. That's roughly what I refer to as relevant technologies in this context of moral enhancement. And then how are we to understand the kind of enhancement that we want to achieve through technological or through technologies that's understood? As you can see here, I mean, that's a very helpful distinction between auxiliary and exhaustive enhancement. And auxiliary enhancement, that's what I'm interested in here. It just means that we do use technology in order to assist in our moral decision making. Instead of exhaustive enhancement means something like we do create independent moral AIs, artificial moral agents that kind of make the moral decisions for us. So that's not what I'm concerned with, but I'm concerned with the question of how can we use technologies in order to assist in our very own moral decision making. And now I here want to briefly illustrate a dilemma that's been raised in a recent paper by Volkmann and Gabriels. And as I said before, I'm not going to solve this dilemma, unfortunately, but in any case, it gives a very nice overview over the discussion landscape within the debate of this moral AI enhancement. There are, let's say, two positions that are part of this dilemma. I here labeled them myself, and namely, we have a contrast between a pluralist versus prescriptive systems. And I just explain now what is meant by this dilemma. So if we look at so-called pluralist systems, these are systems that help users to make decisions that are, given their current values or beliefs that they hold, more coherent and more, better grounded. So the idea is here we use some AI system in order to just basically have more coherent moral thinking, also better moral reasoning skills. So that's the idea of pluralist systems. So for instance, We could engage in exchange, for instance, a conversation with this AI system with the aim of improving specific criteria pertaining to our own thinking, right? So for instance, we could use it to improve our conceptual clarity, argumentative logic, consistency with our own values, and so on. And the big advantage of those pluralist systems is, as the name says, they're pluralist, right? So they basically don't change the human agent's values, but they just make or help the agent to have more consistent views or better reasoning while preserving their own values. So that's the advantage. The downside, as has been argued, is, however, that the extent of possible moral improvement that can be achieved hereby is quite limited. And one criticism that has been voiced explicitly is that those systems do not play any explicit normative role. And let me just explain you what is meant by this by illustrating the adversary systems, if you so want, so-called prescriptive systems. Prescriptive systems are AI systems that are pre-programmed to nudge users into distinct moral directions, which are given by first-order moral theories. And how do they do that? So, for instance, they could suggest specific behaviors in specific situations. The system could just tell you, okay, now in this situation, you better do this, and you don't do that because that's bad behavior. And they could try to persuade users by giving them reasons for why a certain behavior is better than another. And what we can see here, these systems do play a clear normative role in that they might thereby change our own moral outlook, right? Just by suggesting some action that I think is more moral in a certain context, or is for some reason better suited. So that's their advantage, right? That they kind of give us this kind of normative orientation, or they can work towards correcting our own moral outlook. But at the same time, they have considerable downsides. Namely, apparently there's a clear anti-pluralistic tendency, because if the system tells me in a specific situation you ought to do this, then apparently excludes all the other options that might be viable as well. And also there's a threat of those systems turning into exhaustive enhancement that I mentioned before. So turning into some kind of enhancement where basically the AI system just makes the moral decisions instead of ourselves, which is something we don't want because of potential loss of autonomy that goes along with that, and also loss of moral abilities. So our own ability to actually tackle moral issues. So again, this kind of gives you an overview of the current debate surrounding technological moral enhancement. And you can here see the kind of dilemma. So if you have a more pluralist system that allows apparently for pluralism, the kind of change you get thereby is quite limited. But on the other hand, if you have prescriptive systems, that might really help you kind of change your moral outlook in cases where you go really wrong. But this just has anti-pluralistic tendencies. And apparently we're somewhere stuck in between, because it's not easy, given these facts, to say which system is better. So as I said at the beginning, I also don't have a ready solution to this dilemma, but I have a kind of strategy that just leads me to some considerations regarding the design of moral technologies, so of those AI systems that are, should assist us in making moral decisions. So again, we saw that for those pluralist systems, one contention was that it doesn't really morally enhance us, right? Because it doesn't make us, for instance, change our moral outlook where it would be appropriate, and so on. And I think that this is a valid problem, but also that this problem is aggravated by the specific design that so far has been proposed in the literature. And this is, first arguments that will follow right now, where I basically argue against what I call a cognitivist focus in the realm of those pluralistic systems. And then later on, after this argument, there's a second point that I want to make with regard to this dilemma. Namely, I want to suggest that maybe we do not, at least fundamentally, have to choose between both kinds of systems. So it must not be an either or, but it might be that, pluralist as well as prescriptive systems both could be appropriate given certain preconditions. Now, I will say more about that later on, but that's my strategy for now. So first, let me advance two arguments that are kind of aimed against, as I call it, cognitivist focus of the pluralist accounts that exist in the literature so far and that I've also illustrated before. Namely, first one, I call it the argument from empirical research, and the second one, I call it the argument from moral competence. The argument from empirical research really just is an argument citing empirical research, because if we look at moral psychological research, it basically suggests the ineffectiveness in large parts of improving our moral reasoning. Ineffectiveness is meant as in the following: there is a very limited prediction of moral action through moral reasoning. So the point is that even if we get better at moral reasoning, this doesn't mean that we more readily do the right thing. And this is apparently a problem if what we want is some real change in the world through the application of moral technologies. And also another central finding is that moral exemplars, so people who have basically above who have displayed very exemplarily moral behavior, empirically, they do not have above average moral reasoning capacities. So apparently what makes them behave so well is not their reasoning capacity. So there is something that has been referred to as moral judgment action gap, which is the kind of gap between moral reasoning and action those findings to illustrate. And thus, again, this speaks against a focus on moral reasoning, at least an exclusive focus on moral reasoning when it comes to moral technologies. Then the second argument is what I call the argument for moral competence. So this kind of attaches to the findings that I just mentioned and spells them out in a more, let's say, philosophical way. So one question basically is, if we think about cognitive moral improvement, how are we to illustrate this? And it seems from the examples I gave you before, and these are kind of the majority of examples that you find in the current literature, they actually focus on first order cognitive improvement. So what is that first order cognitive improvement? Something like, well, as I said before, conceptual clarity, logical ability, the ability to make correct inferences and so on. But just prima facie, it just doesn't seem that this leads to any moral improvement, right? So even if I'm better at logics, if I make proper inferences and so on, it doesn't seem straight away why this would improve me morally. And just to support this, we can look back at the beginning or the initial motivation of the moral enhancement debate. And this debate in its beginning was actually fueled by the fear of cognitive enhancement, right? So the fear was, if we cognitively enhance ourselves, we might get more efficient in doing all kinds of things, but this might just make people worse. So what we need, in addition to cognitive enhancement, is actual moral enhancement. So that was at the beginning of the moral enhancement debate, essential motivation, right? So I just leave it at that for this and go to the next slide. Okay, so the argument I just mentioned was against lower level cognitive improvement, or first order cognitive improvement. But what about higher order cognitive improvement? So this is something also that's often mentioned in the moral enhancement literature. So one prime example here is that what we should aim at for moral improvement is, for instance, something like perspective taking, right? So the idea is that if we practice perspective taking, we actually get more empathic. We do take others, people's perspective into consideration when thinking and so on. But again, I think that in itself, right, if we only look at perspective taking, it doesn't follow that we get more moral or more empathic or anything like that. And just want to show this with the help of a very simple counterexample. So consider a manipulative perspective taker, right? So you can imagine a person that's really excellent at perspective taking and just kind of uses this ability in order to manipulate the people around her. And it doesn't seem that there's any contradiction with this, right? So this just gives us a hint that perspective taking in itself, so the cognitive ability here in itself, doesn't make us more moral, it seems. Okay, so these were, for now, the arguments against the cognitivist take on moral technologies. Now, what I want to advance in the following, I try to do this briefly, though it's actually a lot of content. So bear with me, and I hope you can follow. So what I think would be valuable instead is, given that at the beginning I mentioned moral enhancement kind of aims at an agential level, so it seems that, yeah, just addressing moral cognition doesn't get us there. And instead, I think, yeah, a tangible point to start is moral competence, as I call it here, right? So if we wonder, okay, what is it then that we want to improve if it's not cognition? I just here tried to kind of, formulate a condition that's kind of still pluralistic in that there is no substantive content to it, but that can kind of, encapsulate the idea of actual agential moral enhancement or betterment. And for me then, how I chose to understand moral competence is really this very, very basic ability to recognize and respond to moral considerations, or in other words, our ability to be sensitive to moral considerations, reasons. And the idea I want to advance then is that, in fact, moral enhancement should aim at increasing our moral sensitivity, so our ability to be sensitive to moral considerations, which would amount to a gain of moral competence. And to just substantiate this thought a little bit, we kind of know this from the reasons literature. So this is, for instance, a quote from Karen Jones, that there is a relation between our sensitivity to normative considerations or reasons and our self-conception. So the thought that Jones advances here is that if we act upon our reasons, if we are sensitive to our reasons, apparently that's not any passive activity that's going on here, but it means that we do guide ourselves in our actions via reasons, that we conceptualize as reasons, and this in turn requires that we have a self-conception as reflective agents. So being sensitive to reasons presupposes that we have a certain kind of self-understanding. And I think we can make an analogy here that being sensitive to moral reasons, as I before defined as a core moral competence, is also related to having a certain moral self-conception. And if we assume this, or if we go along with this, then it also seems plausible, and now that's my core idea, that our sensitivity to moral reasons can be strengthened if we strengthen our moral self-conception, right? Our self-conception as moral agents. So my idea here is that a road to moral enhancement leads through strengthening our self-conception. And we do have a lot of support for this from psychology again. Namely, there is research on so-called moral identity, whereas a moral identity is the importance or salience of morality to a person's identity. And for instance, that can be understood as a trait-like individual difference in the degree to which morality is central to one's identity. So the idea here is that people have more or less strong moral identities. And this moral identity, again, just describes how central morality is to themselves. Or also if they would have to describe themselves, morality would just be very, very central to this self-description. So that's basically what, this encapsulates this idea of moral identity. And again, my idea, just to repeat it, would be that we need to strengthen our moral identity to kind of raise the overall sensitivity of an agent to her moral reasons. And I think this would be a more adequate focus for moral technologies than the mere cognitivist focus that exists so far. Okay, so because I see I'm pretty late already, I go to the next slide, just summing up and then also briefly mentioning the last point. So yeah, we encountered before this contention that pluralist systems aren't really efficient, so they do not really make us more moral. And I kind of, went into the same directions with my arguments, but I argue that it's not actually necessarily the fault of the pluralist systems, but it's also fault of a certain cognitivist focus that they do have. And I just briefly tried to motivate the idea that instead we should focus at moral identity. Yeah, unfortunately, it was really very brief, but I hope you got the main idea. Okay, then just briefly a last point. So again, my idea was that we could, or we should aim at strengthening our moral identity, thus making us more sensitive to moral considerations. Now, one threat that we do encounter here is what we could call moral extremism, because moral identity, again, basically just describes how important morality is to myself, but it doesn't give us a distinct content of morality. That's why it's within the realm of pluralism, which is nice, but at the same time, apparently, this bears the danger that if we strengthen this moral identity, we might strengthen certain kinds of moral outlooks that might be unwanted in a certain sense, right? And now this just brings me to my last point. I mentioned before that I think the initial dilemma must not necessarily, or we must not resolve it by choosing either pluralist or prescriptive systems, right? I mean, you could see that I do have a certain tendency towards pluralist systems just because they are pluralism preserving. And then the question is, okay, under which conditions might we want to prefer prescriptive systems? And maybe, just the conditions I just mentioned, right? So there might be people that do have a certain moral outlook that's not within what we would call a moral consensus. And in this situation, we might actually think that prescriptive systems, so systems that explicitly tell them that certain things are okay, certain actions, others are not, might be more useful, right? But so this is just kind of like a side note for this dilemma. But I think, I'd be very careful in advocating this idea. I think this is also partly a societal question. It's a question about how we define moral consensus and so on. But I think, at least conceptually, this is a place where prescriptive systems, might be, or it might be better to employ those systems as opposed to pluralist systems. Okay, so that's it. So just again, the conclusion very briefly, I suggested a focus on moral identity for pluralist systems. You can see here some pros is, for instance, that it might lead to strengthening of a core moral competence, and thus a change on an actual agential level instead of mere cognition. I also provided on the slides some evidence that I couldn't recite just in terms of time. But there is an impact of moral identity on moral action, as well as emotions and reasoning. So it's an interesting concept in this regard. The main con that we do have is, again, that even if we focus on moral identity, pluralist systems might not be able to change a moral outlook that we might view as substantially deficient. So it seems that in these cases, we might still need to employ prescriptive systems. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That is really, really useful. Thank you so much. So we'll open it up to questions. So if you'd like to go ahead and raise your hand, you can unmute yourself and ask away. Linu, go ahead. Thank you.
I have a question about more enhancing. So in addition to more enhancing, do you consider the offset direction? Can we reduce the moral requirement for decision making? I just considered some persuasive technology. So in order to let other people to accept new information or knowledge, the general point is not to enhancing their cognitive ability, but to reduce the threshold of acquiring true belief. So what is your opinion about the reducing the threshold of moral requirement?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I guess this is quite so how I try to conceptualize let's say morality or moral enhancement in my talk was this point, right, that I kind of try to identify like a core competence, or I would say, okay, this is our moral competence, right? And then the aim would be to kind of improve this competence. I mean, one reason for why I constructed this way is actually that I kind of wanted to stay neutral on the actual question of the content of morality, right? And I think this is what your question is getting at, right? It's rather this kind of like content condition, and do we do we really need to have true moral beliefs? I mean, I think it just gets very complex because there's so many theories about when we do have true moral beliefs, right? So just a variety of moral theories, but then also there's meta-ethical views like objectivism or perspectivism, subjectivism, things like that. So I think in general, that's quite hard to fit this together with the kind of content neutral concept that I try to advance. And then, I mean, I guess some of what we want is actually to have true moral beliefs still, right? But yeah, as I just said, I think it really depends on the kind of outlook that we have. So if we are subjectivists, the bar isn't so high anyways. So I don't know, you know, I don't know where your question, what you aimed at exactly, but I mean, I guess the acquisition of true moral belief, I mean, as I think of it anyways, might be something like an ideal, right? It might be me thinking hard, trying to get closer to what I think is morally valid. So in my mind, it's just some kind of regulative ideal rather, right? It's just trying to acquire true belief. But what I just hinted at is that it's actually really hard, like given the plurality of views about what true moral belief is, it's really hard to say when to actually reach that. That's why I don't operate with any substantive criterion like that. Yeah, but I don't think we should abandon this ideal or this aim of, yeah, requiring or acquiring true moral belief. But yeah, so yeah, I don't know if I would go with your suggestion to lower the threshold, just because I think it has some regulative power. So that's more like a pragmatic approach.
Thank you very much.